All right, everybody, welcome to another episode of The Nostalgia Trap. I am your host, David Parsons, and I'm ready to bring you another great conversation. Got a great guest today. George Ciccariello-Maher is on the show. Very excited to bring you that conversation. But before we get to that, I do want to say a couple words about this 9/11 anniversary that I'm seeing all over the place right now. It's kind of a nightmare every year when this comes around. And the reason it's a nightmare is because I feel like the mainstream media, whatever that is, the corporate news machine, they have like a fucking DVD or something that they just put in and press play every year when this anniversary comes around. They say the same stuff. It's all very maudlin, and it's all very patriotic, nationalistic, jingoistic, etc., etc. And, you know, I think that for people that are younger especially, I wish they had a different idea of what 9/11 actually felt like and what it's meant. It hasn't been this moment where we've all come together patriotically to kind of examine why this happened in any complicated way. Instead, you know, 9/11 launched us into this era of endless war and drones and surveillance, torture and extended terrorism, etc., etc. And when I say terrorism, I generally mean the stuff perpetrated by the U.S. military machine all across the world, which creates terrorism and makes our world and our country, etc., less stable, more violent, and just generally shittier. 9/11 made the world shittier, for sure. And 9/11, is when I say that, I mean the response to it from our state, from our media, and from our people. It's been a nightmare. And, you know, we talk a lot about millennial socialists on this show and how they came of age during, like, the Obama years, and they saw the bailout after the financial crisis of 2008 and Trump and all that stuff. And that's what's depressing them. Seeing the kind of neoliberal Democrats not really present any kind of challenge to the rightward march of the Republican Party. All of that's upset young people, and rightfully so. But me and George and a lot of others that came of age a little bit, we're a litlittle bit older. I was born in 1978. So I was in my early 20s when 9/11 happened. And, you know, this is a moment that, again, it came from the show, I think, when we talked about to Shuja Haider, this idea of young people, I would say of some privilege, at least enough privilege to go to college, although, you know, I don't know how much of a privilege it is to go to college anymore when you have to take out tens of thousands of dollars in student loans. But that aside, it is a kind of a privilege to go to college. And there is this thing that happens to young people when they get out of college. And it certainly happened to me, which was feeling, you know, very smart, very sharp, ready to take on the world. And then this big letdown, this big shock of what the real world was actually like. And when I say, like, what the real world was actually like, I mean paying bills. I mean the material elements of survival. I didn't really know that stuff. College kind of floated me through. And college and having, coming from, you know, lower middle class parents who struggled very hard to make sure that, you know, food was always on the table and we had access to the things we needed. The result was I didn't really have a realistic vision of how much it cost to exist in this world. So when 9/11 happened, I was living in the Valley, San Fernando Valley, in a shitty house rented with a bunch of other people I went to college with. We were trying to just make it. I was temping at some office. Ultimately, that existence of kind of being more or less hand to mouth after attending college and expecting that I was going to get some career out of it. 9/11 happening during that moment was important to me because it forced me to start connecting things, forced me to start connecting my own kind of lot in life and the kind of like growing recognition that life in America is a lot harder than the image that is projected. Connecting that with 9/11, connecting issues of capitalism, issues of the lived experience of capitalism with the kind of jingoistic nightmare that was unfolding thanks to George W. Bush and the psychotic people who were in charge at the time. All of that connected for me. I was working at a place called Medtronic Minimed at the time. And fuck Medtronic Minimed, if anyone's listening that's associated with that evil company. Medtronic Minimed, Medtronic is one of the largest manufacturers of medical supplies in the world, if not the largest. They're a big evil medical corporation, and I worked for them selling insulin pumps to diabetics. They've developed Minimed makes insulin pumps that provide better lives for people with diabetes. And especially for children, these pumps extend the lives of people with severe type 1 diabetes. So this is a medical device that's really kind of a miracle. I think what shocked me, and this is how naive I was, this is again like right around September 11th when this is happening and I'm working at this place and thinking about this stuff. I couldn't believe that Medtronic didn't give these pumps away. I couldn't wrap my mind around the fact that this company made this device that was a miracle device that extended the lives of people who were sick, and they were selling it to people. That just blew my mind. I mean, this is before like Michael Moore's film Sicko. This is before there was kind of like a wide-scale acknowledgement or recognition that the profit motive at the center of the American healthcare system is a really gross, disgusting thing that we should not tolerate. And I think a lot of people obviously don't want to tolerate it, but the people in power do. So we have this situation where medical companies, pharmaceutical companies, doctors, etc., make a shitload of money off of sick people, and that was a big deal for me to kind of recognize that, because my territory that I was in charge of at MiniMed, where I was selling pumps to, was West Virginia. So the people that I talked to on the phone were families that were very poor, and they were desperately trying to get this device so that their children, mainly their children, could live more comfortable lives, could stop suffering. And the fact that I had to haggle with these people over prices on the phone and go to my bosses and tell them that the people in West Virginia don't have the money to buy the pump. Can we just give it to them? And bosses telling me, no, we don't give it to them. We don't have economic assistance. One boss actually told me, tell them to just put it on their credit card. One of the families that I remember the most was a father who I talked to almost every day because they didn't have a phone on at their house. He stopped at a gas station and talked on a payphone, called me, some 22-year-old dude in some call center. He called me every day from a gas station in rural West Virginia from a payphone to ask if the pump was going to be approved and if we were going to be able to get it to them with a discount. And I had to tell this guy no. And all those experiences infuriated me, broke my heart really, and made me realize like how sick the fucking system was. And all of that was happening. You have to understand, I'm sitting in a cubicle in the San Fernando Valley telling poor people in West Virginia that this company will not give their child a pump, and they're going to have to find some other way to ease their child's severe disease. Telling them that while the cubicle mates all around me have fucking 9/11 shit, patriotic displays, flags, all that kind of kitschy America first garbage that somehow poured out of warehouses in China and came over to the United States as American companies sold this shit to people. There were 9/11 calendars, flags. I swear the girl next to me was wearing a fucking FDNY helmet while she was working. I mean, it was out of control. So all that stuff, the kind of hyper nationalism 9/11 happening all around me in this awful company while we're ripping off poor people and trying to sell them devices that ought to be devices we're giving to them. All of that made me think, and all of that, really set me on a path of beginning to investigate American history and capitalism, etc. So that's my story. 9/11 really radicalized me, truly, because my roommate happened to go and buy Howard Zinn's People's History of the United States right after 9/11. He's like, we should all read this as a group. And we kind of passed that book around, and that really began my process. That's when I decided I wanted to get out of the Valley and go to graduate school and study American history and really get into the whole thing. So that's my 9/11 story, and I know everyone has their own, but I think that we 9/11 is that it begins. I just wrote on Twitter that it began the 21st century, but it really began. I say that because it began this moment, and at this moment that's extending all the way to today. I mean, Trump, I'm not sure if he would be president without 9/11. And what I mean by that is that there's a kind of acceleration in the imperialism and the cruel impulses of this country after 9/11 that I think that the Republican Party has capitalized on big time. So that's something we're going to have to come to terms with. Okay, enough 9/11 stuff. My guest today, actually, we talk about this on the show, so I think it's perfect. George Ciccariello-Maher. He is well-known, I think, person for people on the left, but he's a professor he was a professor at Drexel University. High-profile incident at Drexel University in 2017. He tweeted very famously what I think is a beautiful tweet. All I want for Christmas is white genocide. I think that's hilarious, and anyone can see that as a satire and an attack on the ridiculous white supremacist idea that a white genocide is a real thing. Anyway, he got attacked by the right for that, and ultimately ended up resigning from Drexel University, effective December 31st, 2017. So this just happened last year. And when he resigned, he cited, quote, nearly a year of harassment by right-wing, white supremacist media outlets and internet mobs after death threats and threats of violence directed against me and my family. So, this guy is a lightning rod in a lot of ways. And I wanted to talk to him about what that's like, what that experience has been like, but also, getting away from just the kind of troll element of that media presence. I wanted to talk to George about his background and how he became who he is and where the politics came from. So we had a really fun time, and I hope you enjoy this conversation. Been trying to get George on the show for a long time. I hope he comes back too. He's a really, really great and important voice for us as people on the left. Okay, so I think that's about it. I'm going to get started in the conversation. I do want to point out that if you like what we do here on the show, please think about subscribing to the show, supporting the show. You can do that at patreon.com/nostalgiatrap. That's Patreon. Become a subscriber and you get access to bonus episodes and other stuff. We are totally listener supported here, so any support you can send us will be appreciated. Thanks as always. I hope you enjoy this conversation. This is me talking with George Ciccariello-Maher. What in your younger life, I mean, did you know that you would become an academic, and what in your life led you to kind of head towards getting an advanced degree and all that? Because not everybody does that. What was it in your life that led you to that?
So, I mean, I grew up in the country in Maine, and I grew up sort of piss poor, as we would put it. Mm-hmm. We, didn't have anything. I lived sort of in the forest. We didn't have electricity for the first 9 or 10 years of my life. My father was a lumberjack, like a logger. And my mom, when she got a job, was a social worker. And the constant message to me was that there was one way out of this situation, and that was the only way, which was to study, and not just to study, not just to go to school, which would have been a high enough aspiration, I think, on its own, but it was really like, you need a full scholarship, you need to study, you need to be the number one best at what it is that you do, or this will not work. And it was sort of driven into me at a very young age, and I think, these things are both, they transform who you are. But also, I'm really thankful for that having been made into such a sort of unquestionable mantra in my life, because that was something I didn't question for a long time. I just worked and studied. And through, a series of elements that were mostly, luck, but also, that work and that study and that dedication, I managed to get into some really good schools and move toward a doctorate. At which point I began to wonder what the hell else am I going to do? This is
yeah, right.
But also once you're used to really having free reign to think about and to study what you want, to write about it, to sort of put your mind to grasping what's going on in the world around you, that's not a very marketable skill, right? You're not going to go work at a law firm with that, or you're not going to go work in a factory or in a pharmaceutical company with those skills. And so at some point it became clear to me that that was what I would do. Teaching, which I like to do, but also more importantly, having a space to research and write, and to do what I think is tendentially, or can be, I should be very careful, tendentially non-alienated labor.
Yeah.
I don't think that's the case with many academics, just to be perfectly clear. I think, and that shit starts right in grad school, where you basically are cloning your advisor's research and doing something that will be, marketable on the job market. And that is alienated labor,
Yeah.
right?
Oh, totally.
You get to do it from home. You get to, hang out. You get to travel some places, maybe go to conferences, but that's more alienated than what I was able to do with a lot of my work, which was to occupy, a space in academia where I could really write about whatever it was that I wanted to.
Yeah. Yeah. And I mean, and speaking of like what you want to write about, I mean, at what point is politics entering into it for you? Or do you come from a family that had a kind of social justice orientation? Or, for me, it's like always like the question for me on this show is always like, at what point does like capitalism become an issue for you, or we start to think about those bigger issues? Where's the kind of the left come into your life?
Very, very late. If we're talking about the actual left, I like to think, of course, many people would like to think this, but I like to think that I'm sort of a natural communist. But by that, I mean that I was not a red diaper baby. I was just someone who grew up poor and who could have, of course, taken in this bifurcation that occurs in consciousness, could have taken a very different path, right?
Yeah, definitely.
And when I was growing up, there's definitely a period in which I just wanted to be rich, right? That's what poor people want, is they want to not be poor anymore. And at what point do they realize that not being poor also involves the abolition of poverty?
Right.
And so that came very late. But my parents were sort of left liberals, progressive, anti-racists, not organized in any way, just engaged, just sort of in the small moments and messages and even the small moments of class hatred that they revealed to me, allowed me to think a little harder about these things, although much of it would not become clear until later. I ended up getting a scholarship to a local private school, which meant being surrounded for the first time by rich people, actually knowing rich people really for the first time in my life.
Yeah.
And again, we're talking about an extremely damaging process, but one through which, what I learned was really, it was just essential to my political development, which was to begin to understand what it felt like to be up against, this kind of wealth and this kind of consciousness as well. And then, and again, this is something that almost like, it's like a Polaroid, right? It takes a little while to develop, and so over time it begins to sort of be clearer. And once you become political, you're exposed to political consciousness and political organizing, you can then look back on those things and be like, oh yeah, that's why I was so angry when that happened. That's why I was so frustrated, is because that was a rich person treating me in a certain kind of way.
Yeah. How much is anger and resentment, and how much has that been an engine of your kind of political consciousness? I feel like for me, and for a lot of people on this show, it's definitely Are
you familiar with me in any way?
Yeah,
because the reality is that it's very, very essential.
Yeah,
and I actually think there's no reason to shy away from that. Yeah. I think. And I work in the history of political thought and in radical thought, and there's this sort of, even among sort of leftist and even Marxist political thought, there's this idea that resentment is a sort of, is pathological. When in reality, resentment is actually simply a code that that the wealthy and the powerful often use to dismiss the concerns of the subordinated, right? They say, oh, you're resentful because you're poor. Yeah, of course, no shit, I'm resentful because I'm poor, because this is not the way the world is supposed to be, because I did nothing to, to be put in this position, and you did nothing to occupy that other opposing position. So I think these things are essential. Anger is essential. And so this gets to the fact that I think even before ever encountering leftist organizing in any concrete way, I was exposed to the left through music, through, and through hip hop, and through, certain kinds of hardcore, and specifically through, groups like Rage Against the Machine, which had an incredible platform for, engaging in sharp, really, astonishingly sharp political analysis, getting me interested in the Zapatistas, getting me interested in struggles in the United States as well. And then, groups like Dead Prez later on had a huge influence. And I told, when I was talking to M1 from Dead Prez once, I told him, I said, listen, I grew up in Maine, in the country. There was no organizing. There's nothing really, concrete being done that I could plug into. And the only way that I could become radicalized in part was through music. And it was through Dead Prez and other groups like that I began to think, more directly about these things.
And before the internet, even, I mean, the music was kind of like one of the central distribution sites for that kind of sentiment. Like I tell people all the time, like, you know, in college, I was in college in the 90s. I didn't have the internet to go to, but I heard Rage Against the Machine songs on the radio, and sometimes they'd play these like deep album cuts at like late at night, you know, and they'd play the ones that like not just Bulls on Parade, but like other ones. And they would, you know, the songs that like they would be like, you know, Americanize, View the World from American Eyes. That stuff, like it shocked me because. And it shocked me because I'd never heard things like that before. Like it hadn't really been exposed to ideas like that. And you're right, like that music led me like down the rabbit hole, basically.
Absolutely.
Yeah, that's a really overlooked part of the culture, I think, is how I don't know. It's weird because MTV was selling us that stuff in the 90s.
Yeah, but you're right that you had to go a little deeper. You know, for me, it's like college radio station that was local.
That's right.
We'd go in and dig through the records and look at what was there. The used record, you know, record shops, you know, be shoplifting from mainstream record shops, and really getting these things, which, again, like I want to emphasize, this is stuff that had this ability to tap into the mainstream, right?
Right.
And had the ability to tap into what was a political consciousness, which was going on, what was going on in Los Angeles, what was going on in New York and elsewhere, and really translate that, universalize it, that, you know, at a certain level, you know, sort of Lenin's What Is to Be Done of the newspaper, you know, spreading this consciousness across, you know, a broader national landscape. And that was essential for me, at least.
Oh, definitely. And how much did that like turn your attention towards the politics of Latin America, listening to that music?
Hugely.
And all that? Yeah.
Hugely. And particularly Rage Against the Machine, particularly getting into some of these things, you know, this is around the time I'm finishing high school, going to college, studying Latin American politics, and eventually ending up in Chiapas before my undergrad was over, to do research that I had come up with, and traveling to Cuba, traveling to Chiapas to study the history of Latin American revolutionary movements. But this is something that came out of this just, you know, very sort of like eclectic approach to politics, which had been developing without movements and developing without clear levels of consciousness. At the same time, though, this was when Seattle was happening. This is when when I was in undergrad, we were organizing and we went up to Quebec City to shut down the FTAA. You know, you get tear gassed for the first time, you confront the riot police for the first time, and you begin to think about what's going on hemispherically. And this is part of what led me to, you know, to focus more on Latin American politics.
What was going on when you first got down there? When you first started, like, kind of getting involved with activism, what were the central concerns? Because I know that there's been a lot's changed in that story, and particularly, you know, I'm thinking of Venezuela. At what point does Venezuela, I guess, become a concern of yours, and when do you start heading down there?
So when I first began to think and write about Zapatistas, that was in, like, you know, around like 98, 99. I'd lived in Spain for a little while and been exposed to, you know, some more radical thought while I was over there, and gone down to Chiapas. But this was a period in which is the aftermath, the sort of like anarchist wave that comes in the aftermath of the Zapatista insurgency. And this was what was going on at that point, right? Huge summit protests in the global north, and Zapatismo and other kind of you know, movements in the global south that people were paying attention to. Now, if you fast forward a few years, the Zapatistas had entered into a period of silence, and very interesting things were beginning to emerge in Venezuela. I was aware when Chavez got elected. I was, you know, aware that when I myself was in the streets being tear gassed in Quebec City, that Chavez was inside those walls helping to destroy the free trade area of the Americas. This was the first huge success of this sort of like, you know, alternative globalization movement, I guess, as people were calling it back then. And then it was over the next couple of years that things really began to heat up, and the coup happens in Venezuela in 2002. And from that point on, this is as I was about to enter grad school, I began to focus more on, honestly, like more on the place where things were happening, right? The place where things were interesting, where interesting questions were being posed of us. And in part, the frustration at the insufficient answers given, especially by like anarchists in the U.S. when it came to questions of, you know, of struggles in Latin America. The ways in which, for example, Zapatismo was molded and interpreted in a certain kind of way, fetishized really by northern anarchists.
And the way that you talk about like the intersection with like U.S. anarchists, like how are these? Because you say this is like the late '90s that you're starting to get involved in this. Like this is before the internet and social media especially become like a way for political organizations and activists and organizers to make connections with each other. How are you? How are you involved in this movement? Give me a picture of like what the left looks like at this point. Is it really kind of like you guys having meetings and creating literature? Is that like kind of what part of what you're doing? Is there
in the late '90s? Again, I was in college at this point. Everything was really super fragmented as well.
Right.
We were organizing, like campus organizing, to go to these demonstrations, and things were very, very different than they are today. There was very little sense that you were part of a broader thing, except insofar as you'd have these big protests in Seattle, and you'd look at that and say, that's something that I'm also involved in. But you weren't actually concretely involved in these people's lives in the way that I think you are today. And it was really after that, as things got a little later, I started to do sort of anarchist organizing in England, organizing for sort of May Day, and then anti-war organizing when the Iraq War was breaking out. I was in England. And that's where, we started to do sort of local anarchist organizing, squatting, and just broader kind of levels of agitation. And then when I returned to the United States, started grad school in 2004, '03, I eventually got involved with, reevaluating the history of questions of race, for example, in the United States, and the history specifically of anarchist and communist approaches to thinking through race as a central element of U.S. history. And I eventually joined an organization that broke up a few years ago now called Bring the Ruckus.
What was it? What was Bring the Ruckus?
Bring the Ruckus was a cadre organization. In other words, an organization of militant agitators, not a mass organization. That was national in scope, and that was founded essentially around the centrality of race as the sort of what's called the linchpin, keeping American capitalism together. Roughly, the idea that a unified class struggle has always been difficult in the United States because race is such a key factor in smashing class unity.
Right.
And so it was an organization that strategically centered on fighting white supremacy as a way of facilitating and unleashing broader levels of class unity. And we did this through sort of anti-police organizing in particular, organizing in and around workplace struggles with that centered on questions of racial oppression in particular, and eventually migrant organizing in the Southwest as well.
God, so many like different things going on within this within this kind of landscape of the left that I feel like we on this show we always talk about liberals, we always talk about like kind of like national politics, but you've got a connection to this kind of like grassroots American left that's kind of like visible, like you said, to the mainstream and to the rest of us only at specific moments. Like we're still talking about the battle in Seattle in 1999, and then Occupy in 2011, which I feel like was another place where Americans like saw the left on TV and didn't really know what to do with it. But what was were you at Occupy in New York, or were you at other Occupy sites? What was your relationship when Occupy crops up in 2011, right?
Right. I was living in Philadelphia by that point. I was still in some kind of contact with Occupy Oakland when it emerged through national organizing networks. But my own participation centered on Occupy Philadelphia, which is a very specific kind of Occupy. It shared elements with other sort of disappointing Occupies. Where you had a Democratic Party apparatus, you had a bunch of liberals, very white, that were very resistant to, I think, what the message the left was bringing to Occupy was, which was, this is all well and good, this 99% thing, but let's talk about actual structures and struggles and problems that we're confronting in building a broader class unity.
Yeah.
And so, for example, the founder of Bring the Ruckus, Joel Olson, wrote this great pamphlet at the time, the point of which was that the 99% is something that has to be built. Right? It's not just like we have this ratio that we can magically invoke to bring people together, because what we found out in the camps was that if we had a people of color caucus, we'd be denounced as being divisive of the unity, right? When what people were actually trying to do was to overcome these questions through struggle and build a a stronger, real unity instead of the false unity that simply declares itself. And so that's really, I think, what a lot of people are doing, struggling over questions of race, struggling over the question of the police, and the mayor who in Philadelphia pulled this maneuver of embracing Occupy and then denouncing it and then evicting it. And so it was a very complicated thing. But the question in all these moments, I think, is how is it that the left, especially the left of small numbers of organized militants, how is it that you confront and deal with a real mass movement with all of its, warts and all? Because there will always be wars. There will always be problems to be overcome. And the question is always one of not sort of in a sectarian, minoritarian way denouncing the mass as sort of backwards or not grasping what's essential. I mean, that sounds like a caricature, but it happens all the time. But also, neither that nor embracing and uncritically, upholding what it is that the masses argue, right? And so Occupy had a whole bunch of problems around a sort of déclassé, category of largely white, recently graduated college students who were promised a lot of things and they weren't getting them and they didn't have access to them. And so there's this kind of like middle class nostalgia that permeated a lot of Occupy. And really hindered it in a lot of ways. And these are the kind of things you need to confront. In Philadelphia, we're talking about a very nearly majority black city in which there were very little, not only very few black city residents participating in Occupy, but when we begin to push on certain elements of how Occupy was conceptualized, we realized there's no reason for people to participate in it, or better put, that there are plenty of reasons that people would be driven away from it. In the way that it was formulated, the way, you had like Ron Paul people out there. Right-wing nativists out there. And you had a general disregard for questions of race in the city. And so people were just talking about the 99% and talking about class and not realizing the sort of interface of race with class that really defined the city of Philadelphia.
God, and the way you put that, I'd never really thought about it quite that way, that you can see, part of what comes out of Occupy is this kind of like middle class white resentment that like the young white kids didn't get what, their parents got, and that kind of helps me explain why the kind of, the kind of whitewashed version of socialism we're getting on The View these days is kind of it's kind of aimed exactly at that, like bringing back the New Deal, kind of, like bringing back like, and it seems like it really, as much as the Democratic Party is going to maybe kick and scream about taking on these issues, they're really like, they're really basically core liberal issues. They're aimed at the middle. I mean, it's aimed at the middle class, right? Yeah.
And the political imperative that emerges from understanding that is not to denounce them and say, well, fuck these sort of like spoiled, formerly middle class people.
Right.
Which again, like on parts of the left was very prevalent. Yeah. And it's, nor is it to erase that, right? It's to ideally craft some kind of unity of, as Joshua Clover puts it in his great recent book, Riot, Strike, Riot, he says the unity of the holders of empty promissory notes and the holders of nothing at all, right?
Yeah, right.
Those who have never had and will never have anything, with those who were promised something and frustrated when they didn't. Because the reality is, when you look at the history of revolutions in the world, you have this interesting category, which is, you realize that it's actually not always the poorest and the most deprived people who start revolutions. It's those who were suffering from what's called relative deprivation. In other words, they thought they were going to get something and didn't, right? This is the history of middle-class segments that spark revolutions because they were living in a certain kind of way and then lost that quality of life. And so we need to understand that is a main motor of revolutionary change and take advantage of it.
Yeah, totally. I mean, that reminds me of the bonus march of veterans coming to the White House, essentially, during the Hoover administration, and that scared the shit out of the ruling class. The idea that there would be these veterans who are, essentially owed something, right? And they seem like a dangerous set of people. When people talk about revolution, in the United States, are we in a revolutionary situation? I mean, some people would really laugh at that idea. Other times I look at like what things that happen in Charlottesville and other things like that, and I feel like we're in a really transformative and violent situation. What's your judgment of that?
I mean, I think if we look at things, first of all, materially, we realize that we're in a moment in which prevailing economic structures are collapsing in ways that is not unprecedented, but is important. And is also possibly irreversible. what I mean by that is that capitalism is failing. And the question of, is capitalism simply going to find a Keynesian, rebirth? Is it going to be saved in a certain kind of way? Or is there really no space left to save it? I think that's an open debate. I tend toward the idea that materially speaking, capitalism is nearing something like a real terminal crisis. But what that means is also that, and this is equally crucial, that the arguments that the ruling classes and the ruling sectors are put forward are falling on deaf ears. They're not convincing anyone with these ideas, right?
Right.
Their policies are failing. If we look at what's happening to the EU, of course the EU is becoming an apparatus of the ruling elite of Europe. And of course, when we look at NAFTA, it's doing exactly what many people thought that it would do, which is to make small numbers of people incredibly rich under this guise of globalization, which was in many ways, or at least in some segments, as David Harvey puts it, a utopian project of global governance, but which was mostly and in its majority function a project of ruling class domination and sacking and looting. So you've got these things happening, and people get frustrated with them and upset with them, and you have economic crises that can't be resolved very easily, and they turn to either the right or the left for a solution because there's no center left.
Right.
And this is where the question of populism comes up. People are in huge numbers turning to populism on the left and the right. Populism on the right is kind of unapologetic. It can do whatever it wants. It can be racist. It can be brutal, as it often is. It is a lie. In other words, it's also a trick to get poor people to blame other people, to blame migrants, to blame Muslims for the conditions of their life. Sure. And that's why, of course, you have someone like Trump who, no one actually thinks he gives a shit about poor people, but he manages to convince through a certain mode of rhetoric and persuasion. But again, this persuasion doesn't happen on materially neutral ground. It happens on ground in which people were actually fucked by Clintonite democracy, and neoliberalism, and so you get this sort of fraught debate about how to confront what's going on today. And is Trump simply a racist, or is it something else? What about the white working class? And what about left populism? Because you also see the efficacy of someone like Bernie Sanders, who, again, warts and all, bad policy, and all, is someone who was able to channel this frustration toward the left. And I think it's mandatory for the left to offer explanations for people's conditions of life, right? Yeah. So when people are suffering in the Rust Belt, to make it perfectly clear what's happening. And it is not migrants, right, that are causing this. And it is not, Muslims, it is not Syrians, it is not Iraqis that are causing, their really shitty lives. And that's, I think, a huge part of the leftist task is to engage in what are populists. Argumentations, right, which again are not sectarian. They're not geared toward cutting a tiny little group off into the pure left, but they're geared toward really opening up a conversation with a mass that can be potentially moved to the left. And again, the center doesn't do this, right? The fucking Democrats. And I don't usually have like TV channels, but I just got some. And so like MSNBC is really just still babbling about Russia, despite the fact that no one really gives a shit about it. And it's also because they have nothing else to say, right? And they're celebrating, people, liberals and progressives are being drawn towards celebrating the fucking FBI, right?
That's been a great development.
As though this would... Yeah, as though that's something that's going to save us. But of course, the FBI won't save us. The Democratic Party won't save us. This becomes a huge danger, not only for the left, but not only for the poor, not only for people of color and queer and trans people and women, which it is a huge danger, but also a huge possibility for radical transformation, because what's happening means that possibilities are afoot. And I like to say, I grew up in the 90s. I mean, I guess you did too. And the 90s fucking sucked. Yeah. There was like nothing happening. Yeah. Nothing changing. There's this eternal, facade of permanence of the end of history and, post-Soviet world. I'm grateful that things are changing. I'm grateful that we can see the possibility for change.
Yeah, totally. And it's been kind of a weird privilege to live in that era, to live through the 90s of that kind of like stale end of history, Francis Fukuyama globalization moment, where even just like the show Seinfeld being popular was kind of a symptom of that kind of like we're in a no zone of like we don't go anywhere from here. So yeah, as much as it's like fucked up to live in 2018, it does feel like there's something else happening. There's something stirring in American society and in the world. But it does worry me when we see like populism rising up, because you're right. The right, like they're like unleashed. They can do whatever the fuck they want. They can say whatever they want. And that really, to me, that's scary. And like you have like identified a couple of different kinds of, I don't know, phenomenon in American society, and one of them you've intervened on is like the mass shooting phenomenon. That you had a tweet that was about like the white male patriarchy, basically, right? But what do you mean by that? Like, to get like outside of the kind of world of Twitter, what do you mean? Why is that such an important thing for you to point out when there's a mass shooting, that like there's a kind of ideological element to it?
I mean, when a mass shooting happens, I think we literally have ideology shoved down our throats immediately.
Yeah.
And I mean this in different ways. I mean, mainstream liberalism, I mean, conservatism, and I mean, there's certain ways that they both kind of pervert the question, right? And so one of the other things I think there's less attention paid to this is that, like, I'm also very, very critical of these quick knee-jerk reactions that call for more gun control. Not because I think we necessarily need a bunch of guns out there, not necessarily because I think we're preparing to overthrow the government with all of our guns on the left, but because I just think that gun control is mostly going to be an entirely failed project that can't even begin to do anything except take the guns out of the hands of poor and black and brown people while white people keep them. And so, so that part of course, the liberal dogma, I find very, very unconvincing, because it, just like the conservative dogmas, try to conceal what's actually happening, right?
Right.
I mean, conservatives say, oh, look at Chicago, look at Chicago, look at Chicago. Well, a fucking white kid going into a school and shooting 50 people has nothing to do with poor people on the south side of Chicago engaging in turf warfare. It has nothing to do with that, in the sense that there's a mass phenomenon that grows out of a certain kind of psychological, situation, and one is not. What they do share is that they're both grounded in white supremacist patriarchy in their own different ways, right?
Yeah.
And that the fucking situation in Chicago is the result of white supremacy, just like mass shootings by white men are the result of white supremacy. I mean, and patriarchy, precisely because, and we've seen this very clearly in a lot of shootings, that, well, first of all, statistically, it's really unquestionable. It's almost always uniformly men. Even when you've got sort of like mixed shooters, ethnically mixed, often they identify with whiteness and embrace whiteness as a worldview, and often they embrace blatant and brutal misogyny, or display it in their lives, or responding to a sense of entitlement to women, just as whiteness is a sense of entitlement to the entirety of the world. So when these things are frustrated, what it provokes is often incredibly irrational, right? It's not to say it's like white patriarchy doesn't mean someone standing up and writing a manifesto of the white patriarchy and killing people seem to be enemies of that. It is a bizarrely irrational psychological reaction, but that emerges out of a specific kind of psyche. And I think that's the thing we need to try to understand. And part of the reason that even well-meaning people don't want to even raise those questions or entertain them too much is that they feel like they have to have a policy solution. And this is common to a lot of reactions to these things. Like Trayvon Martin and other things where people are looking for a stand your ground solution, which actually doesn't get at the question either.
Right. And I mean, even like, some people that are kind of on the mental health tip, that are like, well, we have to, do better in mental health, and which I agree with. Obviously, that's something we do terribly with mental health and health in general in American society. But like, the idea of like how you address the kind of like underlying ideology, and the underlying ideological symptoms of these that are producing these mass shootings, that's a trickier thing to deal with. That's a trickier confrontation to have. And I agree with you. That's what makes me think that they're not going to stop, because I don't really know how you have that kind of ideological confrontation.
Absolutely, and it's very difficult. I mean, it's one of those things. So in 1956, Frantz Fanon who was head up until that point been a psychiatrist in a colonial French clinic in Algeria, he resigned because he said, listen, like as a psychiatrist, I'm trying to make individuals right? And I'm trying to fit them back into the world, but their world is a profoundly sick world.
Yeah.
And it doesn't take much to realize that we live in a sick country, right? I was living in Mexico, and there's still this kind of, Black legend about the Aztecs and how brutal they were and all this human sacrifice. And people like to repeat this shit as though they don't live in a society that is absolutely and fundamentally about human sacrifice. And
right.
which it happens all the time and is a part of symbolic and economic life of this country. So I think it really is essential to draw these things out and draw out how sick the society is. And there's really no other way to get toward even beginning to fix it if we don't even want to talk about it.
Yeah, it makes me think of how quickly people in America will talk about or use like the image, this imaginary idea like the third world as like, that's the place where it's hell. That's the place where people are really shitty to each other. And it's like, have you looked around, at the country we live in? And that's just, I feel like that's just a kind of national misogyny, if that makes sense. They kind of, you're right. It's blind to the kind of insane sicknesses that exist in our society. But like speaking of the mass shootings, like here in Ventura, California, a small town that I'm living in, just the other day was the first day of school. There was this Facebook group for the parents of kids that are going to the schools. There was some alert that came through from the police department about a mass shooting, like possible mass shooting that a kid was threatening. And the parents went crazy on these Facebook pages, and watching it was kind of like watching like them like devolving into fascism in real time, because they all basically had the same attitude, which is that if there are threats to our kids, then we need to have like the police essentially surrounding our schools. We need metal detectors. We need all the apparatus of the state essentially to come into the schools and make sure our kids are safe. And there was never any talk about like education or the school at all. It just fell into like a complete war mentality. I feel like Americans don't really see how gross they are when they fall into that.
Yeah, and it's this sort of paradox that happens when people's lives become more and more and more secure. When they, in a way, lose touch with insecurity, that in a way there develops this sort of fetishization of security that allows for this kind of response and brings people right into the hands of what is a fascistic mindset. And also, and it's also just like a super wrong, right?
Actually
not going to protect you. Like you could, like how many, and this is where it gets to like how many of these mass shootings would have actually been stopped by, armed security guards? Not that many. How many would have been stopped by gun control? Really, honestly, not that many. If you look at how people acquire guns and like where they were, and whether they would acquire them anyway. And so it just gets frustrating to see people like refuse to think in these situations. Instead to fall back on certain kinds of non-thinking that they're like, that are comforting to them because it's much harder and creates much more kind of, psychic frustration to actually engage with the questions.
Well, yeah, there was a dad that was like, I'm going to go stand out in front of the school. And he was like live streaming himself on Facebook, like, don't worry, I'm standing in front of the school. And it was like, what are you going to, like, just from a practical perspective, like, what the fuck are you going to do, if anything happens? But then, yeah, like how quickly people are to internalize just like the idea of security and safety. That's something we've been like kind of seeing, unleashed as a more accelerated phenomenon in our lifetime since 9/11, I feel like. But do you feel like the cops are like, is it because we see more of it on social media, we see more shootings and body cams that it looks like the cops are crazier than ever? But do you think that's kind of wrong, that it's just been, we're seeing it now? There's a continuity actually to police abuse?
I think it's really difficult to say.
Yeah.
And part of the reason is that there is more scrutiny of it. Certainly the public is seeing visually and experiencing more of it in a very public way. And certainly you can look at numbers, but it's very difficult to parse on the one hand what's being reported as police abuse and what isn't.
Right.
And also what's simply being covered up, what's being concealed under questions of race, what's being concealed under easy arguments around, I thought he had a wallet, or I thought he had, he had a wallet instead of a gun.
Right.
And so I think, the numbers are going to be very, very difficult for us in that situation. I think there's a couple of things that are clearly happening. And this gets back to what's, in a way, like, I say this very hesitantly, but what is in some ways better about the age of Trump than the age of Obama? And that's the fact that no one is walking around saying that we live in a post-racial society anymore. No one is walking around believing, as people actually did believe, that we had overcome this question, that finally, we were going to, have this moment of equality, substantive equality in the United States for the first time. And what's important to understand are the dynamics that are unleashed by that expectation, and the counter dynamics. And this gets to something that I mentioned earlier in terms of revolutions and how they emerge, which is that when Obama was elected, a lot of people really did hope and think, a lot of Black Americans really did hope and think that this was going to be solved finally, right?
Yeah.
And in many ways, it's the frustration at the realization that that's not going to happen through the channels of government that leads to the emergence of mass resistance, mass rebellions, new movements, Black Lives Matter, and other things. On the flip side, and this is where I mean the counter dynamics, is you also have a turn toward open reaction, right? The frustration, the reaction to Obama by white supremacists, by your subtly racist aunt and grandmother, the reaction to Obama, and then the reaction to Black Lives Matter. And all this amplifies this sort of paranoid mentality of white Americans, which has crystallized this idea of white genocide, that white people are the victims and are under threat, and are no longer in control, but have lost control under the being victimized by American society. This counter dynamic leads to not only the violence we see in the streets, not only the explosive anger of white people ordering at a Starbucks counter, for example. Right. If they were talking about real resentment, right? It's just this inexplicable explosion of anger at nothing, because you've been promised the world and you're not getting it. But not only among them, but also among police, right? Yeah, also among white people in general committing more violence. Police are, on the one hand, on edge, but also sort of like, also feel like they can get away with things, also maybe feel like they can't get away with things. We're seeing situations in which people are also demanding their rights be respected more, and paying the price for it. So all these things are happening at once, and all these dynamics, and there's no easy way ever to pull these kind of dynamics apart. They're sort of crashing into each other, and
right,
But that's the story of American history.
Yeah,
right?
Yeah, totally.
The black struggle.
Just hearing you describe it that way, is like it's all bubbling to the surface right now in a really dramatic way, but it's all stuff that's latent and been there the whole time.
Yeah, and the dynamic is constantly this, that when Black people fight for and accomplish and win freedom, white people freak the fuck out and call for more and newer structures of containment and oppression and incarceration. And that's what we're experiencing, and that's what we're witnessing right now, is this dynamic of struggle and the counter dynamic that it always emerges against it.
It's kind of a great point about Obama. That idea that it makes sense that Americans would think that a black president would solve the racial problem, because Americans have been trained to see like kind of representation as the way we kind of address racism, if that makes sense. They're kind of like, the more people of color and the more people from different groups of minorities, would as long as they're in positions of power and as long as they're visible in the culture, then we've solved something. And it seems like Obama was kind of the ultimate example of the fallacy of that kind of thinking.
Yeah, it's literally never been true, and yet people just keep saying it. So
right, yeah, right, and it's weird because liberals just still love Obama. I mean, they absolutely. To them, I think the ultimate liberal fantasy right now is that Trump is just going to go away and Obama would come back, or Hillary or something, and everything's just going to go back to normal. Do you think that? I mean, part of me thinks that's possible, and that's maybe my biggest nightmare, is that like some like milquetoast neoliberal like Cory Booker or something is going to win the election against Trump, and will like, I don't know, return to 2014. Does that? I don't know. Is that a vision that you see, or do you think Trump has permanently broken the center like that?
I mean, I think, it's the center in a way is broken, not permanently. But the risk of someone like Cory Booker is precisely that they present themselves as not center, right? They present themselves in a different kind of way. They take advantage of racial identity and other things as a way to conceal the fact that they are literally actually worse than Obama. But that's not a foregone conclusion, I don't think. I think that's a clear risk. But there's also this dynamic, this populist dynamic that's happening, which could see a Bernie Sanders type candidate. Of course, as we're seeing with some of these Bernie Sanders type candidates, like certain ones that will not be named coming out and mourning the death of John McCain, you realize that so much of this is also just concealing bad politics to opportunistically embracing a certain kind of, politics, not having, to be charitable, not having a political consciousness that goes beyond certain buzz phrases, and that, leading to certain political, outcomes and really an embrace of the center, a reformulation of the center.
As leftists, as radicals, what do we do with that? As we see the kind of like popularity and populism of, happening on the left, and, many times on this show, we've talked to young people who are like, either in the DSA or excited about the DSA, and like all that, to me, like I'm kind of amazed that these thoughts are even in the mainstream. So I'm really torn, and I'm ambivalent in some ways about it, because I'm kind of like, I feel what you're saying, where I think these are just candidates that are going to just enter the Democratic Party and be, Democrats, and that's it, and it doesn't really change much. But on the other hand, it's like, well, if they can move the conversation left, that's a good thing. Where do you fall on that?
I mean, the reality is, and I sort of said this earlier, populism is not a choice we have, right? Populism is the nature of the moment that we live in. So we can either choose to think about what a real left populism would look like. And by that, again, I mean a left-wing understanding that also embraces the need to draw huge numbers of people to us and to the left.
Right.
Instead of, again, taking solace in the fact that we are the vanguard of some kind. So we can either embrace that or we can fail, right? And this is something that Hillary Clinton should have learned very clearly, right? When she did everything right? She's the perfect machinery centrist candidate who didn't stand for anything good, and who carried out a campaign and got beaten by a terrible candidate because she literally was so oblivious to the nature of the moment, right? And Bernie Sanders, of course, was able to step in and understand the nature of the moment. Again, possibly only opportunistically, or as is usually the case, a combination of opportunism and actual sort of like principle, and step in and occupy that space. We don't have a choice about whether we do that. If we denounce what's happening with these kinds of candidates as a mere farce, then we're embracing the isolation of the left. But we, of course, one of the biggest dangers is precisely to uncritically embrace these phenomena, as sectors of like the DSA left, I think, are prone to do, because the risk is precisely that this is a sanitizing of the Democratic Party.
Right.
The abolition of superdelegate votes, is good. But it could also simply allow the Democratic Party to limp on, despite the fact that it's a pretty, useless apparatus, and will always be an apparatus that seeks to channel and defang real opposition movement. So what we need to understand is that these leaders are not causing change to happen. They're an echo of the change that we are pressing, that we are struggling for, and that we're doing. And so it's good when we live in the kind of moment where Bernie Sanders can almost defeat Hillary Clinton in a Democratic Party primary. That's an echo and an index of our own power. But what we need to do is understand the dangers that then threaten that, and pull back and push back against those dangers as we move forward. But we can't choose isolation of, either isolation or assimilation into the Democratic Party apparatus. Both of those choices are bad choices.
Yeah, I mean, I agree. And I know, we're running short on time, so I don't want to bring up everything here. But like things like, I know you've been like active about the situation in Palestine, and that just feels like, things when you're involved in thinking about politics like that, and then you don't see like even a single person within the kind of, federal government, state government, anyone within like American government apparatus who feels the way you do, or who will at least have the spine to express it. it's really hard, I think, to kind of think about electoral politics when you're thinking about these other giant issues of justice and things like that. But like, I brought that up in part because I wanted to talk a little bit about these kind of like these different third rails, and it's certainly one in academia I feel like is Israel. Did you feel like you were, and I guess this gets to your online personality a little bit, but like, did you feel ever that you like kind of had to not say what you really felt within the halls of academia about things like Israel? Or you were always the person that seems like, fuck it, I'm going to say it and let the chips fall where they may?
I never censored myself in terms of saying those kind of things, but I'm not a scholar who works primarily on Israel-Palestine, right? And I think, and I know, I'll say very clearly, I know the hammer would have come down a lot sooner if I were.
Right.
When I was a young untenured faculty member, I worked mostly on Venezuela, and it was very controversial. But like a handful of like Venezuelan gusanos in Miami are not going to sway, the decision-making apparatus of the university. And it's when you touch something like Israel-Palestine, or when you say something about, patriotism in the troops, or when you touch the other real third rail, which is race in the United States. And, as the saying goes, the third rail is the third rail because that's where the power is.
Yeah.
And when you touch those things, what's happening is that you're touching something that's very sore for the governing, governing elite, because I think they understand the function of race in a certain way. And so when you, and it gets precisely in a moment in which the president is using racial resentment of that kind to stir up and maintain his support, of course, you're going to get a reaction. And so it was in the nature of the moment, but also in the nature of the United States as a racially capitalist society, that these things evoke these kind of reactions.
Well, yeah, and you got, for a while, I felt like you were, and I think you still are, an expert at kind of trolling these different groups. And how much was there like an element of trolling when you say something like "all I want for Christmas is white genocide" or something like that? Like, how much is there? You must know that you're going to piss people off when you say things like that, right? And like, what's the idea behind it? Because I mean, I love these tweets. I think they're awesome, and I really, for me, I'm always like, both when I see your tweets and I saw all the trouble you got into, it like made me want to tweet stuff like that, and and at the same time get off Twitter completely because of the consequences of it. So like, what did you know you were going to piss people off with those tweets, and did you regret kind of stoking the fire of people that made threats upon you?
I mean, I don't think regretting things like that is really worth anyone's time.
Yeah.
But there's a couple things I would say. One is the people that criticize tweeting like that by saying, it's as though it were part of a well-developed political strategy for overthrow capitalism.
Right.
It's not, right? Like, that's not what it is. That's not the point. On some level, I'm just a person who, like, when I see just incredibly white supremacist bullshit and garbage, and the kind of hypocrisy that goes along with concealing that, it's hard for me to not say something about it. And maybe that's a personal failing. Maybe that's something I learned as a child, and maybe it's my own deep psychological resentment or whatever you could sort of pop psychologize as having. It's really hard for me not to open my mouth sometimes. Yeah. But at the same time, and this is something that I've written about extensively, it's really at the heart of my book, Decolonizing Dialectics. I just think we don't understand social change in the correct way often. I think we're taught that, and this is precisely something that traffics under the name that we give it today of centrism, this idea that conflict is bad, this idea that conflict and dialectical oppositions and argumentation and actual, combat are bad things when it comes to transforming the world for the better, when the reality is these are the only things that have ever made the world better. These are the only things that have ever set the world into motion. And so on some level, just because something is controversial or combative or whatever, or too provocative, I mean, there's a huge space for provocation in politics. Of course, the center of our politics has to always be movement organizing. But also those movements are militant, combative, levels of organizing that we need to be engaged in. It's not about lobbying. It's not about asking please. It's like you don't get what you want. And the poor and the oppressed have never gotten anywhere by asking nicely. And they've only gotten anywhere by demanding things and by backing up that demand with a kind of material force.
Yeah, no, I like that, and the historian part of me is like thinking about like the civil rights movement in the 1950s and 60s and into the 1970s, and you talk about like asking nicely, and a lot of people I think would say, well, Martin Luther King Jr. asked nicely, and he got a lot, and it's like. It feels like that's the wrong way of viewing it, because Martin Luther King's movement wasn't really about asking nicely. I mean, there's a kind of that civil element of it, but they were fighting in the streets. They were fighting in the streets with the police and with white vigilantes and the KKK, etc. It was not an ask nicely kind of thing, and it was backed up. Like Martin Luther King's kind of soaring rhetoric was backed up by people who were ready to do the real dirty work of the revolution.
Absolutely, and King operated in a political context of Malcolm X as well,
exactly.
In which even Malcolm was saying, listen, like people are in the streets now, they'll be throwing hand grenades next year if you don't change something. And what you have is this sort of dialectic between sort of loyal and disloyal opposition, as they would put it in some kind of like literatures on warfare, where you find that, that it's precisely when Black power, the Black Power movement and Malcolm X and Black self-defense become real threats, that the power apparatus, which had been demonizing King, turned to him very quickly and said, listen, can you help us get out of this bind we've gotten ourselves in?
Yeah, it feels like there's always got to be something for the ruling class to lose. There's a guy that was on this show a long time ago. His name is Howard Levy. He was one of the first American servicemen to refuse service in Vietnam, and he served a prison term for it. And he told me, a few years ago on this show, that if the left disappoints him, if it's not like kind of making power make a move, and he said if you're not forcing power to make a move, you're jerking off. And I always love that. I always love that.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And CLR James put it in The Black Jacobins, he says the rich will only be defeated when running for their lives. In other words, they're not going to give you anything voluntarily.
Yeah.
When Oscar Grant was murdered, we were organizing the streets of Oakland, and there was a series of 3 riots that happened in January of 2009. The first riot caused the killer to be arrested. The second riot, basically forced him to be indicted. And the third riot was, a response to him getting bail. And what you saw was the state apparatus actually enter into motion only when people rioted. And so at the same time, the political leaders stand out in the streets and say, or get on TV and say, this is so irrational. You're engaging in this mindless behavior of rioting, when it's actually the most rational thing, because it's the only thing often that creates results. And it's the same reason we know about Black Lives Matter. And it's not that the organizers behind the movement have done anything wrong, but it's backed up by the force of Ferguson and Baltimore that has really transformed people's consciousness of the Black struggle in the United States, and revealed to many people who didn't even know or didn't want to know that very little has changed since the 1960s.
Yeah, and that's an awakening that took about 5 minutes after Obama was elected. I feel like that post-racial moment didn't last very long. And what's really fucked up is that like that backlash that happened under Obama, part of it was like led by Trump, and the birther movement and everything. He kind of like served as a public container for all that white supremacy that was coming out of the woodwork. And here we are. George, thanks for talking to me. It was really I feel like you're a voice that's really necessary and really fun also on Twitter. I know that Twitter is not your main outlet. What are you working on these days?
I'm doing some writing. I'm working on some researching armed movements in Mexico and thinking about what it means for communities to actually engage in self-defense, substantial self-defense, which of course is very relevant to the U.S. Context as well. And I'm also working on a book about what the world would look like without police, what abolishing the police would actually mean in practice, and the things that are going to work when it comes to police reform, and the things that definitely are not going to work. And like, spoiler alert, most of the things that are being proposed are, like body cameras, all these things are not going to do anything. And so we need to, again, be willing to think realistically about really things that seem impossible. Yeah.
It's weird. The body camera thing is part of this wider kind of like idea that technology is going to save us from all these problems that we haven't solved for centuries. And it's really weird to think that the technology would be what we look to, but it makes sense considering the culture. Well, like my students a couple years ago with the body cam thing, they all like kind of said that, well, the cameras are going to solve police brutality because people will see, they'll see the shootings, they'll see the injustice, and they'll do something about it. But it feels like after a few years of that, it's not the case.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, Eric Garner was essentially, killed on camera.
That's right.
We know, what's been going on. People don't need to see this, more to understand it. And what we need is ways of controlling the police and pushing back their power. And really thinking about, again, what it would take to defend communities and build different kinds of communities that don't require the police to begin with. That's the only way we're going to be able to deal with this, this crisis of policing, which, again, thanks to these movements in the streets and Black Lives Matter, is really coming to the fore to the point where it's undeniable.
Well, that book sounds awesome. It reminds me of kind of like the work of Angela Davis, following up on and I feel like I often have Angela Davis and other prison abolition voices in my classes, and a police abolition book would be really great. So I'm really looking forward to that, George. Thanks so much for your contribution to the conversation, and thanks for talking to me today.
No, thanks for having me on. This is a great conversation.
All right, I had a great time talking with George Ciccariello-Maher. I hope you enjoyed that conversation. There's so much more Nostalgia Trap stuff out there. Go to nostalgiatrap.com. We've got all our episodes up for free. And if you want more bonus episodes, secret conversations, etc., go to patreon.com/nostalgiatrap. Subscribe to the show, and you will get access to all the stuff you don't get regular access to. Thanks, as always. I appreciate it. We'll see you again. Take care. Bye-bye.